Why is modern poetry difficult? Well, this evening's talk is something of an experiment for me, because thus far in my professional career, my semi-professional career, and the bits of my life that aren't to do with my career at all, I've kept a clear separation between me, senior university or college bod, academic me, poet me, the broadcaster, and so on. And there was a rationale for all that once, but I don't think I want to live my life that way any longer. So if tonight I talk about meetings with poets and others that have shaped my life, as well as poems by those poets, I hope we'll both see a communicative logic at work and not just some kind of narcissistic self-communing. Well, having begun diffidently in that way, I think I'll now degenerate into miserable apology. In one sense, calling this talk, Why is Modern Poetry Difficult? Well, may have been a terrible mistake. After all, a great deal of much-loved modern poetry isn't difficult at all. For example, Carol Ann Duffy, Poet Laureate, an honorary fellow of my college, writes poems on matters of current interest that hold the attention precisely because of their clear relevance to our unclear society. It's not difficult poetry, per se, but poetry that strives to render difficult issues less muddy and more vivid. And the literary landscape of the 20th century was populated by, among others, many poets with clear intentions and definite subjects, writers to whose poetic credo any allegation of large-scale ambiguity would have been inimical or felt to be insulting, from John Betjeman to the Mersey poets Adrian Henry, Roger McGough, or, for all the local spikiness of his writing, Philip Larkin. But let's go back. Imagine for a moment that you are a reader of modern poetry in 1922. You are well versed in the poetry of the Great War, recently ended, an admirer of Edward Thomas's bucolic lyricism, perhaps a fan of Thomas Hardy. Indeed, in 1922, Thomas Hardy is still alive, and barely 3 decades have passed since crowds lined the London streets to watch the funeral cortege of Lord Tennyson. But here is a new poem, The Wasteland, by a little-known avant-gardist, a new idea in itself, T S Eliot, and this is its first page. While you listen to me read the lines, or read them as you can on the handout, I'd like to try a little experiment. Imagine you were filming this poem. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger See, the shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sledge, and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night, then go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch, what branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu. Meinierisch Kind, wo weilest du? The first section of The Wasteland is entitled The Burial of the Dead. And in a literary sense, Hardy and Alfred Tennyson and all poets writing in orderly metre with regular end rhymes are among the corpses. Voices appear unannounced, unnamed, ambushing the reader, menacing, yet sometimes inappropriately seductive, come in under the shadow of this red rock. Mixing memory and desire, childhood recollection and sexual dread, Marie, Marie, hold on tight, and down we went. Communicating sometimes with a fierce clarity, I will show you something, but communicating something that is nothing. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Sphinxes and oracles fail, English glides as if dreaming into German, or into cross-territorial protestation about national identity of the kind which would ruin and remake Europe in the decades following the poem. Bin gar keine Russin, stamme aus Litauen, echt Deutsch, I'm not a Russian woman, I'm from Lithuania, a pure German. Eliot's original title for The Wasteland was He Do the Police in Different Voices, a quote from Dickens' Our Mutual Friend. And The Wasteland is strewn with fractured quotation, phantom voices, quotes from Baudelaire, Dante, the Jacobean dramatists. Indeed, latent in its heaping of broken images is the intuition that we are all quotations, that no one's individual identity is sufficiently wrong, strong, or real to bear much scrutiny, that all a writer can do is catch and mimic a ventriloquist or one-person séance, doing the polis in the city's different voices. The certainties of the Victorians, indeed all certainties, apart from our being billeted to the valley of the shadow of death, are gone. But the post-1945 existentialism, minimalism of Samuel Beckett, say, or the spectral reveries of William Burroughs, another one-person séance, seem oddly only a step away. And in fact, for such a remorselessly negative and fearful work, The Wasteland is culturally and even technologically predictive to a startling degree. Weary, it looks forward. On this first page alone, words are superimposed in a constantly shifting kaleidoscope, which makes us, I think, reach for the vocabulary of cinema, montage, voiceover, fade, dissolve, in order to describe its movements accurately. Even though this poem of 1922 was written at a time when cinema was only beginning to be able to utilize those techniques. So difficulty in the poetry of T S Eliot, which I'm taking crudely and for brevity's sake as synonymous with 20th century modernism, is a multi-sided issue. But one aspect of it that we should maybe hold on to is that negativity and progress, the exhausted and the predictive, operate in an unexpected and initially counterintuitive relationship. Equally paradoxical at first sight is Eliot's intuition at this early stage of his writing that what we share is our aloneness, what we have in common, our ultimate isolation. The bottom line of what we know is that we cannot finally understand our own human condition. In this state of not knowing, to have faith, to trust in something intangible, becomes an act of daring, which in Eliot's case would involve a conversion to Anglicanism, but which in the modernist tradition more generally evolves as skepticism and suspicion regarding belief. There are exceptions, and here is a different direction taken by a different writer. The American poet John Ashbery, in my book, the most continually interesting poet of the last 50 years, once said in an interview, most reckless things are beautiful because of most reckless things are beautiful in some way, and recklessness is what makes experimental art beautiful, just as religions are beautiful because of the strong possibility that they're founded on nothing. I feel this also even in the great modern painters, such as Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko. Everyone accepts them now as being major artists, and yet, wrote Ashbery, does their work amount to anything? There's a possibility that it doesn't, although I believe in it and want it to exist. A further aspect of poetic difficulty in our time, then, is that we co-create it with the author, if, that is, we want to believe in the poem and make it exist. And here begins that extra autobiographical difficulty of my own. Ashbery is the poet with whom my own name, as an academic, is most closely associated, I met him in 75, I got to know him better in about 85. I'm in periodic contact with him now and can hardly put those facts of my life out of my consciousness when I read him or write about his poetry. So what do I do with that? And with Ashbery as one of our guides, I want to go on talking to you about recklessness, experimental art, and wanting poetry into existence. As I get older, I find myself becoming more interested in how readers got into poetry. This is how I got into it. In broken French in Manchester in 1968. A lot of people say, oh, English, I loved English. I had this fantastic teacher, Miss or Mr. I had terrible teachers. They were awful, absolutely awful English teachers. They were unrelated as far as I knew, but they were almost all called Wilson. What was going on? All hopeless. But a French teacher, it's 1968, I'm 14, Mr. Rees, Bill Rees, who I now realise is less than 10 years older than his charges, comes into the room and says, right, here are 2 poems by somebody called Baudelaire. You're going to translate one of them, and then wanders off. So I look at these 2 poems, one of which is Harmonie du soir. Voici venir les tons vibrant sur sa tige. Chaque fleur s'évapore ainsi que l'encensoir. And we're off. And I thought, God, this is it. If this is poetry, this is what I want to do. I don't know if I just want to read it, write about it, be with it, but this is it. Trouble was, my French wasn't very good. And I couldn't find English writers I liked as much as I liked Baudelaire. So I sort of went sideways, or off in a zigzag direction, into American writing. And subsequently, most of my life with poetry has been, in one way or another, lived in relation to New York or to Cambridge, UK, often shuttling between the two as if to try and make them one in some sense. My first book, as Rebecca noted, academic book, was Statutes of Liberty, the New York School of Poets, which was the first attempt to look at the milieu of Ashbery and OHara, his friend and contemporary who died young in 1966. And along with James Schuyler, Barbara Guest, and others, these were the poets who wrote, while the abstract expressionists, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, painted, and the subsequent pop painters, Andy Warhol et al., painters identifying New York in the public mind with avant-garde painting at its peak. They're all to some degree painterly poets, and poets who include many references to the city of New York in their work. It was a one-time mayor of New York, Ed Koch, who remarked with a forgivable chauvinism that, quote, anywhere west of the Hudson is just camping out. And while I've lived in Washington, D.C., I've traveled all around the States, I do share that sense of something utterly uniquely magnetic about Manhattan, the mountainous island that Frank O'Hara wrote about, the canyons of steel that the other Frank, Sinatra, hymned. And moving from the Hudson to the Cam, while I'm aware that there are other good universities in the UK, I've noticed this over the last 40 years, worked in or had dealings with some of them, soft spot for Oxford, where Harris Manchester College gave me a bicycle and a fellowship. But it's Cambridge that took me in when I was 18 and that has taken me in again now that I'm a bit older. So, Cambridge and New York, so utterly unalike and yet alike in their uniqueness. Both bubbles, of course, but a uniqueness incarnated also in the physical fabric of each city, as with the stones of Venice or the pavements of Paris. Brief digression or question. Venice has really had its day. So maybe has Paris. So possibly has New York. I sometimes think, looking at the growing Cambridge, that it's maybe on the verge of finally actually becoming a city in the world sense, ... question mark, close brackets. Anyway, there I was in Manchester moving from French to American poetry, crabwise, and I would spend hours in the one bookshop that sold poetry books imported from the US, admittedly doing more reading than buying. Allen Ginsberg's incendiary poem, Howl, was still only a decade or so old at that point. And Wilson's bookshop in John Dalton Street would position Howl and books like it, almost hiding them on a special table at the back of the shop. almost as if they were sinful, which of course in the case of Howell they were. Here is the beginning. Deep breath. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night. Who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz. And we're not even at line 5 yet. So you could talk about a lot of things, and we don't have much time. Liturgical influence would certainly be one of them. A rocking repetition. Lots of the lines beginning who, as if it was an anchor or a propulsion that would then send the line off. But then that's also not just liturgy, it's Charlie Parker, it's post-1945 bebop jazz and the taking of a chordal structure, which is very simple, like the chords of How High the Moon, or a 12-bar blues, and then riffing on it in a soaring improvisation, taking the breath as far as it will go before coming back to that anchoring, EEBA chords or whatever little sequence it is that is the who, the anchor, the propulsion, the start. So contemplating Howell and Who Can Blame Me, I got hooked, thinking it a new kind of poetry, which it was, and kind of wasn't. I thought of Allen Ginsberg, tireless, long hair, Old Testament beard, before I got to Cambridge, and then read a book of poems published exactly 100 years before Howell, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. And if you want to look at and admire the facial features of these two hirsute men, you can do so by looking at the handout, where I think we see certain things in common. Whitman looks out of the photograph, long-haired, wearing a work shirt with his long matted beard, and there was a direct connection from Whitman's Leaves of Grass to the Beat Generation, poetic as well as presentational, extending beyond an aversion to visiting the barber. Now, there had, of course, been poetry in America pre-Whitman, but he is the founding father, the good grey poet, the first poet to write in what would later be called free verse, the first poet to build a poetic adequate to America's vastness, ambition, and above all, its democracy. And it's in the title, We Are All Like Leaves of Grass, here for our brief season, and then gone. In Song of Myself, he writes of grass as the beautiful uncut hair of graves. So we are also all at one with the earth we tread on and will eventually return to, and whether we know it or not, at one with each other, I think, at least in our better moments. Whitman takes the visionary nature romanticism of Wordsworth and turns it into a practical politics for a new American democracy. The leaves of grass are a multitude, too many to count. If you tread them down, they just spring up again. And leaves of grass are, of course, in one sense, all the same. We'll come to the downside of that a little later. But a sense of the sameness of humanity gives Whitman's work compassion and a marked sense of what we would now call inclusiveness. But I wasn't in America in 1972, though I was beginning to realize I would have to go there. I was in Cambridge. So who could teach me about all this poetry, show me what to read next, and important for a student studying English, show me how to write about it? The short answer was a very tall person, a fellow of Gonville and Caius College called Jeremy Prynne, who publishes his own poetry as J.H. Prynne, and who at that stage gave an annual sequence of lectures called Poetry and Language. Jeremy was and is mildly terrifying. There are one or two people in the room I think could also testify alongside me. At 18 years of age, I wasn't used to the concept of a lecture. Even less was I used to hearing lectures delivered as his were, without notes, and in completely formed, elegantly complex sentences and paragraphs, without the ums and ahs that the rest of us mortals use as linguistic props. And his lectures were difficult. And the poetry he lectured on was difficult. And the first poem in the first collection of poems by J.H. Prynne begins, the whole thing it is, the difficult. I came to realize with hindsight there was some extremely sophisticated positioning going on here. He was pitching his lectures just above the cleverer heads in the room. He made you up your game. But there was more to it. Underneath it all lay a deep conviction that poetry worthy of the name had to be utterly serious in its attempts to find a language adequate to the condition of ourselves and our world, and that the artifice of poetry, its rhymes and rhythms and puns and metaphors and metre, or for that matter the programmatic erasure of any or all of those things, were not decorative or game-playing, but intellectually and in other ways intrinsic to poetry's aim to deepen understanding while beguiling. Mr. Prynne slept by day and did his teaching, other than lectures, at night. So I would creep up to see him in Keys at about 10 p.m. when his day was getting underway, his night was getting underway. He is to this day the best read person I've met as far as I know, fluent in Chinese among other languages and able to converse with scientists and colleagues of different disciplines in their language. Out of that, one brief but hopefully relevant anecdote about poetry and science talking to each other. Prynne introduced me to a number of fascinating people, including the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Francis Crick, as in Crick and Watson, who, slightly improbably it seemed, was in Cambridge for a poetry reading by the beat poet Michael McClure, American poet. This would have been 76 or 7. And I could see immediately when I met them an affinity between Crick and McClure. With neither of them was it the easiest task to get a word in, any word. Both were supremely self-confident, and both exuded from their different vantage points a deep sense of the interconnectedness of things. I left the party that followed the reading with Rupert Sheldrake, then a fellow of my own college, Clare, and we agreed it had been an extraordinary evening, not simply in terms of listening to some powerful personalities, though that was certainly the case, but to visionary thinkers who restored the possibility, generally considered lost, of conversation and shared understanding across the arts and sciences. Sheldrake, you may know, is an unconventional, indeed a maverick, philosopher-scientist who believes that the universe is alive and that nature has inherent purposes. In his latest book, The Science Delusion, he writes, "Similar patterns of activity resonate across time and space with subsequent patterns. This hypothesis applies to all self-organizing systems, including atoms, molecules, crystals, cells, plants, animals, and animal societies. All draw upon a collective memory and in turn contribute to it." And as we walked out into the night, I can remember Rupert Sheldrake asking himself, or me, or the night air, whether the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the last person who had read everything, i.e., whether Coleridge was the last figure, Prynne being the nearest contemporary analogue, who had sufficient reach to understand the scientific advances of the day fully alongside the literary and artistic endeavours of which he was a part, but then to go on and next stage see the affinities across and between them. And this has stayed with me because it immediately became to me an important jigsaw piece in my sense of what a university or a college could be on a good day. So English was my subject, eventually, slightly reluctantly. And Cambridge English, which generated the new criticism, as it came to be called in the USA, and which still underpins English as a discipline worldwide, it always had a slightly scientific inflection, Cambridge English, even though it could never be a science. By good fortune, I met all the first founders of the discipline, Richards, Leavis, Empson, while I was a student, usually with consequences for me that were embarrassing. F.R. Leavis, a fierce moralist, to put it mildly, came to my college once in his extreme old age to speak to students, but only on condition that he be smuggled in by night and that fellows of the college, whom he viewed as all hopelessly corrupted, correctly in one case, be excluded from the event. What he did was he read chunks of poems by T S Eliot aloud, talked about them, and then fell asleep. Would then wake up sharply, read more poems, talk about them, and then gone again. So it was, in equal measure, calming and alarming. My role was to look after him at the end of his talk. Being young and callow, as well as somewhat in awe, not knowing what to say, I blurted out the first question that came into my head, God knows why, and said, "How do you keep fit?" And this very old man stared at me fixedly and said, "I run at night." In retrospect, I seem to have spent a disproportionate amount of my time 40 years ago shepherding scary old men, never learning from the experience, oddly. A few years later, I invited the eminence grise of the Beat generation, William Burroughs, to give a reading from his new novel. This I did with some trepidation, in the knowledge that Burroughs, author of the once banned Naked Lunch, was an almost lifelong heroin addict, alcoholic, had a criminal past, certainly had a thing about guns, having shot and killed his second wife, indeed, and had written some of the darkest things, albeit the most darkly brilliant things, that I'd ever read. After he divulged to me in conversation his age, which was advanced, I had the temerity to ask William Burroughs what he thought about death, to which he shot back, "Well, it's a step in the right direction." But going back to the foundations of English as a discipline in Cambridge, from which we've perhaps strayed, another founder was I.A. Richards, author of the 1925 book Practical Criticism, and to this day, it's a bizarre thing to explain to anyone who hasn't done a degree in English, but the paper lasts 3.5 hours. The students go in with no real preparation in one sense, read the paper for half an hour, then have 3 hours to write 3 essays on poems, fiction, drama that are on the paper, but with no names, no pack drill, no date. You don't know who wrote them, you don't know when, you respond to them. It is unjustifiable, unhistorical, unfair. What do you do if you recognize one of the poems? Do you fess up or pretend you didn't know? Supervisors have been answering this question for decades. Their answers are all evasive. But having taught it as well as sat it, I can safely say that for some reason it works. But I'm not doing it now. I'm talking about what happened when I did it. My own experience of sitting the practical criticism exam in the summer of 1975. It was bittersweet. Picture me, if you will, finishing my exam paper, thinking I'd done well as I was going to do, and then idly turning the paper over with just 5 minutes left before the bell went, and feeling suddenly utter astonishment and chagrin. Freeze that picture, please, and we'll come back to it. I wanted to go on. I wanted to go to America. I wanted to write on these poets. Some of them were so obscure they were not widely known in the USA, let alone here. At one moment of near delirium, I became obsessed with the Tulsa School. More seriously, I wanted to write about Frank OHara, John Ashbery, these painterly poets. I wanted to commend them so that people would read them. I wanted to be positive about them and not negative. I don't really like, I now realize, the word criticism. It's unhelpful in many ways, and isn't life too short to be spent shredding inadequate words or reputations? Aren't there more positive things to do? And in particular, I've become besotted, I'm still besotted, with a New York poet I've already mentioned, really the poet of New York, Frank OHara, 1926 to 66. If you go down to the railings, just due south, Battery Park City, just with what were the Twin Towers behind you, you look out to New Jersey and the big clock. There are words in the railings, on one side by Walt Whitman, on the other, Frank OHara. But he wasn't well known for a long time outside New York, apart from in Cambridge, UK, San Francisco, and a few other places. An associate curator at the Museum of Modern Art at the time of his death, aged 40. His ironic fate to be knocked down and killed by a beach buggy on Fire Island, where cars were banned, after he became separated from friends during a nighttime beach party and wandered off on his own briefly and forever into the dark. Frank OHara is, I think, the funniest poet in English, which to me is no laughing matter. Ever since reading him, I've asked students to ask of any writer they're reading, is this a writer who uses comedy? And if so, in what way? And if the writer isn't, then why are they choosing to withhold humour, which is, after all, one of the qualities, like compassion or consolation or trust, which we can offer each other? There may, of course, there very often are, compelling reasons why humour is suppressed. And I'm not asking for shallow jokes. Actually, I quite like shallow jokes. Or the so-called wit of Alexander Pope in the 18th century, which I never could stand. And I fully understand why the tragedies of Euripides or the major novels of Dostoevsky are not exactly rib-tickling, though humour is not entirely absent from them. But the really great writers, Shakespeare or James Joyce or Emily Dickinson, and in the American 20th, 21st century, Thomas Pynchon, David Foster Wallace, John Ashbery, are subliminally, even when they're not being overtly, funny. They persuade words to make life turn out comedically, to come out okay, even in the teeth of tragedy, which is the genre to which our mortality ostensibly consigns us. And this I value. Happiness, wrote Frank OHara, the least and best of human attainments. So time, as there is always time, for a quick poem by Frank OHara, called, as so many of his poems are, Poem. OHara wrote on impulse, could write in a room full of people talking, enjoyed that challenge, and is the great poet of the fleeting instant or perception. And this one is triggered by bad news. This is 1962, bad news about the movie star Lana Turner. It's not on the sheet, but you'll get the gist. Poem. Lana Turner has collapsed. I was trotting along and suddenly it started raining and snowing, and you said it was hailing, but hailing hits you on the head hard, so it was really snowing and raining, and I was in such a hurry to meet you, but the traffic was acting exactly like the sky. And suddenly I see a headline, Lana Turner has collapsed. There is no snow in Hollywood. There is no rain in California. I've been to lots of parties and acted perfectly disgraceful, but I never actually collapsed. Oh, Lana Turner, we love you. Get up. Of course, there is rain in California, if you spell it out. There's a lot going on there, but it's the brightness and the surface that I want to talk about. It's one of what he called his I do this, I do that poems. He also wrote some fantastic poems which really about what he couldn't do, and he couldn't do this and he couldn't do that, but let's stick with the glowing surface. This isn't, in one obvious sense, at all a profound poem, precisely because it mistrusts profundity in favour of the truth. Our preference as creatures of hope and curiosity for remaining vertical, trotting, breathing, living, as opposed to being suddenly supine, i.e. worst case scenario, dead. Yet the surface lightness is related to its opposite. As with Lord Byron, if OHara laughs, 'tis so that he may not weep. And there is, of course, here a profoundly American drive towards cheering and encouraging. Allen Ginsberg had written about Walt Whitman as a lonely old courage teacher, and OHara, likewise a descendant of Whitman, is a courage teacher here. Come on, you can do it. Lana Turner, everybody, we love you. Get up. And of course, it verges on the sentimental, which doesn't mean there isn't a place for it. As with cliché, comedy and cliché help suture over trauma. And the great poems by Frank OHara let them do that while making us aware, peripherally, of the darkness of all that would have been there had they not. Lana Turner, we love you. Get up. The poem is written on the ferry to Staten Island during a snowstorm on the way to a poetry reading that Frank OHara was reluctantly giving with Robert Lowell, and he gave the reading to the intense mutual dislike of both poets. But I'm not getting up, remember, I'm sitting in an exam room in Cambridge 13 years later in 1975, sitting my finals, having taken that practical criticism paper, checked all my answers, done my best, 5 minutes left, I turn it over, there's one last poem which I'd missed, and it is Sleeping on the Wing by Frank OHara. But I missed it because I was sleeping on the wing. I didn't think it was funny at the time. In the end, not that there is such a place time ever, I came to New York and stayed for long spells in the Chelsea Hotel. Slept on floors in the Lower East Side in the 1980s, when the lower bit in Lower East Side seemed as much an existential category as it was a location on the map. Shopped in the Gotham Book Mart, now sadly gone. Drank cocktails in the King Cole Bar, unfortunately for Wallet and Wasteland, still there. Had a friend called Arnold Weinstein who lived in the Chelsea and claimed to have written a musical with Frank O'Hara called Undercover Lover. I never quite got to the bottom of this. My friendship with Arnold was cemented because on the day I met him, he'd just been told he was terminally ill. The only way was up, we decided. And there was a stay of execution, a new libretto written, a new girlfriend, all good things. Eventually, communication petered out, so I feared the worst. And the next time I checked into the Chelsea, the owner, Stanley Bard, came and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Well, Geoff, Arnold passed on." Then he suddenly brightened and said, "You know what? We've got a new resident in the Chelsea, and he's called Arnold Weinstein." I was quite happy with my old Arnold Weinstein, I thought. But then again, perhaps we are leaves of grass. Tread some of us down, some more of us will spring up. We are the same, aren't we? Sort of. If Eliot saw us as occupying a shared condition of unshared aloneness, the Whitman tradition seems intent on reconciling a commonality of identity and citizenship with rampant individualism, only in America. The lines chiseled on Frank O'Hara's tombstone from his great poem In Memory of My Feelings, quote, "Grace to be born and live as variously as possible." Bear this out, that quintessentially American optimism, or bear out its aspiration, for the American dream, as we know, does not bring good fortune to all and can turn on a dime into nightmare. In the USA, many school children still repeat the Pledge of Allegiance daily. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Under God was added in 1954. The pledge is a diurnal titration that works to exclude any identification with non-American places and cultures of familial origin, any different political allegiances. It's an acid test, repeated daily. It seems that the human leaves of grass must flag up their sameness in the breeze of patriotism. I'm going to read you a poem by Leigh Ann Brown from her 1999 book, Polyverse, which plays with the pledge by reducing it to poetic doggerel, while accusing America of political doggerel too serious for play. It's not on the sheet because I think it works better read aloud. Leigh Ann Brown, pledge. I pledge allergy to the flail of the United States of Amigo and to the reputation for which it stands, one national park under Godmother, indivisible with Lyson Kabob for allegiance. I pledge allegory to the flagellant of the United Statistic of Ammunition and to the reproduction for which it stands, one naughtiness under good, indivisible with lick and juvenile for anatomy. I pledge a lelomorph to the flagelliform of the United State-of-the-Art of American English and to the repudiation for which it stands, one nationalism under one go-getter, indivisible with library science and juvenile court for Alleluia. On my hop I will try to serve Godmother, my coup de grace, and to live by the give-and-take scramble lawn. On my hoodlum I will try to serve Goose, my coupon, and live by the gladioli scrap heap laxative. On my honours of war, I will try to serve go-go dance, my country music, and to live by the gizmo scowl lawyer. It's a light poem, fleet-footed. I don't want to do it the injustice of laborious analysis, but it's also a thoughtfully critical poem nonetheless, that works through an unexpected linguistic mirroring, whereby the semi-nonsense that it revels in as a poem is also mistrusted at another level, the United State of the Art of American English, as obstructionist state gobbledygook to which one should not give a pledge. An apt warning in 1999, on the eve of the era of oratorical eloquence, and intellectual luminosity inaugurated by George Bush Jr. So, my own tale is of two cities and how dependent on both I've been. And most importantly, how Cambridge and New York have connected unexpectedly in circuitous underground ways that led to new connections. Ashbury, the New Yorker, I first met in Cambridge, and life has been full of those loops and bridges. So I'm going to close with the ending of a 1977 poem about Orpheus, prophetic poet of Greek mythology, by Ashbury, later set to music by Eliot Carter. It is itself a poem of loops and bridges, and the worry whether what one is about to step on is a bridge, and not simply, a la Wile E. Coyote, the dangerous air. So I'll just read the close of Syringa by John Ashbery. But how late to be regretting all this, even bearing in mind that regrets are always too late, too late. To which Orpheus, a bluish cloud with white contours, replies that these are of course not regrets at all, merely a careful scholarly setting down of unquestioned facts, a record of pebbles along the way. And no matter how all this disappeared or got where it was going, it is no longer material for a poem. Its subject matters too much and not enough, standing there helplessly while the poem streaked by, its tail afire, a bad comet screaming hate and disaster, but so turned inward that the meaning, good or other, can never become known. The singer thinks constructively, builds up his chant in progressive stages like a skyscraper, but at the last minute turns away. The song is engulfed in an instant in blackness, which must in turn flood the whole continent with blackness, for it cannot see. The singer must then pass out of sight, not even relieved of the evil burden of the words. Stellification is for the few and comes about much later, when all record of these people and their lives has disappeared into libraries, onto microfilm. A few are still interested in them, but what about so-and-so? Is still asked on occasion. But they lie frozen and out of touch until an arbitrary chorus speaks of a totally different incident with a similar name, in whose tale are hidden syllables of what happened so long before that in some small town, one indifferent summer. In an earlier poem, Soonest Mended, Ashbery had written about the necessity of sowing the seeds crooked in the furrow, the zigzag nature of real life as distinct from what's termed here the scholarly setting down of unquestioned facts. There is, I think, a tendency inherent not only in sober academia, but rationality itself, for humans to self-medicate with fact, holding on to precepts and proper names, as I've no doubt done tonight, like candles in a dark stairwell, in order to duck the giddiness and perpetual, unresolvable strangeness of life. But while things are not straightforward in reality, they do connect unpredictably. And the close of this poem is not unlike an articulation of chaos theory, though one wouldn't want to reduce it to that. Chaos theory, a field of study in maths, but with applications in zones as varied as philosophy and the weather, the so-called butterfly effect, yielding wildly divergent outcomes. So you have dynamic systems that are very sensitive to initial conditions, but who knows where they'll end. And Ashbery's expert meandering is a kind of version of that. Even in his zigzag near haphazardry that trembles on the edge of the random, I can still feel myself, though, pulled back to having met, e.g., Francis Crick, along with Michael McClure, in Prynne's rooms one indifferent summer, and recall musing with Rupert Sheldrake about the possibility of poetry and science talking to each other. As Sheldrake wrote, again, similar patterns of activity resonate across time and space with subsequent patterns, all draw upon a collective memory and contribute to it. So finally, one of the reasons modern poetry must be difficult is because it must be wider, or apparently wider, than the single mind writing or reading it, in order to do justice to the collective understanding of reality. Ashbery and Sheldrake aren't saying the same thing, but they're both daring the reading mind to go wider, to zigzag, to not look down, to get up, Lana Turner, to a better understanding. Facing these giddy philosophical conundrums in the exam hall of life, one always has to stop at some point and draw a blank, as I'm about to. But I've been lucky in my life in the number of times that when I've turned over the blank paper, there's been another unexpected poem on the back.